Well, having done that, time went on. Los Alamos got less and less interested in this whole field. Pressure was being put on me to stop messing around with cold fusion. Fortunately for me, I was getting older by the minute, and retirement looked very attractive. And indeed, they had a buyout program where they'd pay you to leave, which was just absolutely incredible. So I took the better of both worlds, and my wife and I both retired and moved to Santa Fe and built a house. And in that house, I built a laboratory. And so now I'm doing it without having to ask any bureaucrats what I need to do next. All I have to do is pay for it, which is no small problem, as you all know. Anyway, having got that set up, I received a batch of palladium from Japan, from IMRA in Japan. And it was a batch of 90 samples that were 8 different sets for the purpose of evaluating those properties of the palladium that were relevant to producing this effect. And that's what I set about doing. Now, one of the calorimeter results that I got from this batch is shown here. This was a calorimeter similar to the one I showed earlier, a nice parabolic type. But here, this is showing the excess power from one of the IMRA samples as a function of time. These values, this is cell current, and this is at 19 hours. Well, you see there's nothing. And then as time goes on, this goes up steeper and steeper until finally we get up here to 196 hours, and we have a very definite effect. And you see there's a very definite onset. You know, above a cell current of about 1 ampere, you get the effect. Below it, you see nothing. Of the IMRA samples, there was only at most 4 of the 90 that I was able to find excess energy in. Now, in addition to the excess energy, the cell also showed that a temperature gradient existed within the cell. There were thermocouples, or thermistors rather, on the cathode, at the top of the cell, and at the bottom of the cell. This is the delta T between the respective numbers against applied power. Now, the gradient, of course, changes with applied power, but when excess energy is made, the gradient is different than when it's not made, indicating that the cathode is the source of the energy. It isn't coming from some obscure place within the solution or from the anode. And all that was written up. And again, had very little effect. Well, then the question came up, well, all right, what is truly going on? We can measure the average composition of the material by different means. McCubry and various others use the resistivity. I prefer to measure the average using a technique that measures the quantity of oxygen that's left over after the deuterium goes into the palladium by displacing oil. But in any case, all these techniques are all average values. And around this time, I became absolutely convinced and published my conclusions that the effect is not occurring in the bulk, it's occurring in the surface, and it's not even just the surface, it's only certain little spots in the surface. So the regions that are nuclear active, the special condition of matter that's required, are very few and far between, and are very much, their properties are very much diluted by the properties of the bulk material. And then the question is, well, how do you understand more about those isolated spots? And indeed, how do you understand a little bit more about the surrounding bulk material that needs to support the presence of these isolated, unique regions to grow? So that was the next order of business. And there's a number of ways in which you can evaluate palladium and get a feeling for whether or not it's going to produce excess energy. And it's on that basis that I've developed a technique which allows pre-testing. In other words, you don't have to go through 99 pieces of palladium that do absolutely nothing in your calorimeter, which you normally would have to wait for weeks to occur. You can do it very, very quickly and sort out a bunch of palladium that will work, and you don't have to spend a lot of time messing around. All right, well, the concept is that in order for the necessary concentrations to build up, there's two processes that have to be optimized. One is the ability of the deuterium to go in through the surface and be absorbed into the lattice. That's the ingoing deuterium. And then you also have to block those methods whereby it's leaking back out, and that's the outgoing part. And these two are independent of one another. They're separate, and they require a different approach to understand them and also to change their characteristics. Well, let's look at the ingoing first. This is the loading efficiency as a function of composition. Now, the loading efficiency is the ratio between the number of deuterium going into the palladium divided by the number presented to the surface by the current. Got that? And that's measured every 5 minutes, so this is essentially the derivative. It's the instantaneous efficiency of loading. Now, if you have an untreated material, you can see that efficiency drops down, and then, of course, as it becomes saturated, it goes down to 0. But if you clean the surface off with aqua regia, that eliminates the surface barrier, and you can see it stays very high and then drops down. And this, you can see as clear effect of the surface barrier. Now, if you have a piece of palladium and you load it up and it has this characteristics, aha, that's got a crap on the surface. Let's get rid of it. And then you do, and then you find this, and then you're at least one step closer to good palladium. The other side of the coin is the deloading, the outgoing. Now here we're measuring the average composition against time. This is deloading after the current has been turned off within the cell. And you can see that there's a delay. That's just due to the inertia of the system, but don't worry about that. There's a straight line relationship here between the square root of time and the amount of material coming off, being retained in the sample. There's a break-in slope here, which is the point at which the alpha phase forms on the surface, and at that point the diffusion rate changes through the solids, and then it goes down at a different rate. It's this slope right here that we want to look at. Now, we plot that slope against composition. We come up with a very interesting observation. First of all, that slope is dependent upon the initial composition of the sample. And that makes some sense, because if we look here at this line, this is the equilibrium pressure of deuterium that would be in the cracks as a function of composition. And you can see it follows it rather nicely. There will be a gradient effect. That is, there'll be a gradient between the material in the cracks and the surrounding material having this composition, because material is being lost, deuterium is being lost from the crack. So the crack surface will have a slightly lower composition than the bulk value that we have to measure here, and that's represented by this number. Anyway, so it follows the expectation of leakage from cracks. But you'll notice that there are certain materials, well, my light just went out, whoops, there it goes, that have a different property. That is, they are able to support a much higher composition at the same deloading, their deloading rate is low at a composition where the deloading rate should be high. It is those materials that we're looking for as being a possible precursor to cold fusion.